Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our adult education series, Thinking Critically, Living Biblically, Attending to Scripture in a Complex Modern World. Glad for those of you who are here. We've got plenty of room at some tables. There's some also loose chairs in the back. Welcome to folks watching online or later on the video, or I guess I would still be online, a live stream or at a later time. Today's topic, health and the good life. So glad to see that pull people in. I'm not making promises. We're going to try to describe the way the Bible talks about that. Very few announcements today. The only main one is, again, we're looking to go to semi-permanent name tags. Some of you have got lanyards with your name tags on them. That's great. If you would like to make one, there's materials in the back corner over there. Free lanyards, pens you can use, and also, I believe, at the usher stations. Entrance and exits to the sanctuary. Make your own name tag. Zhuzh it up a little bit, right? Make it kind of exciting. Put flowers, butterflies on it, or whatever you want to do. Just make sure your name's, legible. So health and the good life. Let's jump right into it. Again, we've been talking this fall about some big biblical themes. How do we, having walked through the Older and Newer Testaments, how do we now look to the Bible as a source of guidance or inspiration for how we might live? Where are places where we see the Bible maybe leading us into places where the church has maybe fumbled what the story's talking about, or maybe misunderstood what that means for how to live faithfully in this world, how to serve our neighbors in this world? What are ways in which the Bible has inspired that, and how do we work with biblical texts in a world that sometimes feels very, very different from the biblical landscape that we see? And indeed it is, right? We're talking about a 2,000-year gap between ourselves and the time of Jesus Christ, even longer, into the Older Testament, and some real cultural differences as well that we're always navigating. So today it's the question of health and the good life, which is a huge topic. The Bible has a lot to say about health, life, death, injury, illness, disease, how one is healed. I'm going to settle down mostly in the Newer Testament, and around the stories of Jesus and some of his followers. But I also want to note that these are topics that really span the pages of the Bible. Indeed, these are a part of what it means to be human, right? How do we manage our illnesses? How do we manage the ways in which life changes for us because of health issues and just the process, of aging? What does that mean for family? What does that mean for community? What does that mean for livelihood? So to start, the Older Testament does have images of what life might yet be like when God has God's way with the world. I'm just realizing, I think this is Isaiah 65:20 and not 25:20. But here we have a vision of a remade world, of a remade Jerusalem. It's kind of the center where God's people will gather, and the ways in which this will be attractive to other nations. And Isaiah's vision of this new Jerusalem includes this line: "No more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered a curse." In other words, this image of longevity, this image of livelihood, right? Being a part of what God wills for the world. There's an acknowledgement here, an unstated acknowledgement of the damage that illness can do to our lives and to our happiness. A similar vision in the book of Revelation. At the very end of the Bible, one of the final lines of the Bible, really, as the seer, this visionary named John, is describing the descent of a new Jerusalem, again, a remade Jerusalem, a new city, kind of this image of what Christians sometimes refer to as heaven, but it's not a far-off place. It's this new reality that exists here among us. And the author says this: "I heard a loud voice from the throne of God, saying, 'The home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He, that is God, will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away.'" So again, an image here of death being destroyed, being overruled, so to speak, but also all of the other things, all of the things that have to do with grief, mourning, crying, being no more, right? This idea of a remade humanity and a new way of being in the world. In other words, the Bible recognizes the problem of grief. The Bible recognizes the problem of impairments, recognizes that life is hard and also unfair in terms of, right, who survives, who has longevity, who enjoys that, whose lives are cut short for all sorts of reasons. So just to note that, right, that lurking in the background of the Bible are this kind of frustration with the way things are, right, this kind of uneasiness with what it means to be human in terms of our own vulnerability to death and to illness. We flip the pages, get to the Gospels, right? We start the Newer Testament with the stories of Jesus. And one of the things that we might notice is there are a lot of healing stories. All 4 Gospels include multiple healing stories where Jesus is doing things that I've never seen done in terms of miraculous ways of setting folks back to health. And so one question we might want to ask is, why are there so many healing stories in the Gospels? The short answer to that is probably because Jesus was known as not only as a teacher, but also as a healer or some kind of a wonder worker, some kind of a miracle worker. We do know of other healers in the ancient world who were able to, for inexplicable reasons, right, were known for being able to bring people back to health. The shorter answer for this, I would say, is because the thing that Jesus taught about the most, right, the reign of God, or sometimes translated as the kingdom of God, is ultimately about human flourishing, right? It's ultimately about wellness. It's ultimately about a new way of being human in the world, where the things that oppress us, where the things that hold us back from fullness and from life are in some ways overrun. And some of that is around illness and ailments. Some of that in the New Testament is around death itself. Some of that is around poverty and social exclusion. But the healing miracles or the healing events in Jesus' life seem to be about underscoring this deep commitment that he has and that God has to human well-being. So that's the main reason, right? This is not just Jesus promising a great life somewhere down the road, right? He seems intent on bringing this to bear or bringing this into reality right now. The second reason why there's probably so many healing stories in the Gospels is because this is where people looked. People looked to religion when it came to questions about healthcare. There was no healthcare system the way we understand it today. That might be good news or bad news for you, depending on your perspective. There were doctors, right? The Hippocratic Oath is an ancient oath that some of you probably, I assume, have taken. You've got medical texts. You've got ancient medical authors in the ancient Greek world who are writing about cures and treatments. Anybody ever read any of these ancient medical texts? They're a little terrifying, are they not? In terms of the technology, in terms of the understanding. You talk about, humors and bodily humors. I mean, all the jokes about bloodletting and leeches and things like that. These are real things. So if you're going to go to a doctor in the time of Jesus, you better have the money to pay for it. You also better have some health, right? There's no guarantee it's going to cure you. Based on our standards today, at least a lot of Western standards understanding of medicine, what we see there looks really quite terrifying in a lot of places. Again, this is where they are in the history of technology. Jennifer can tell you more about the history of technology, especially around medical practices. So you had doctors as one option if you were to fall ill. The other option you have is religion. And so there were a variety of ways one might seek healing from a god, from some kind of a divinity. Maybe the most popular one in the ancient world, at least in the Greek-speaking world, was around the god Asclepius, who was a mortal who became a kind of divine being and was a very popular in the sense of well-visited, well-known, god of healing in the ancient world. You see Asclepius there with a snake wrapped around a staff, that symbol that we still use today of modern medicine, of a single snake encircling a staff, comes from Asclepius. One of the things that you would do if you were ill, you could go to a temple, and Asclepion, there's one that some of us visited about, 2.5 years ago in Greece. You can see the size of this. Maybe it's hard to tell without scale. This was a massive, this is obviously just the foundation, but a massive building that was both temple and kind of like a hospital. You would go there, pay money to the priests of Asclepius. Of course, there's going to be some kind of transaction involved. Maybe you would sacrifice an animal, and most people would then fall asleep in their little area, their little niche in this temple, and hope that the god would visit them in their dreams. And often he would come as a snake in their dreams, which would terrify me. I'd wake up screaming personally, but to each their own. And we have inscriptions that have survived of people describing things that they were healed from, right? When the god came to them, kind of ancient, religious propaganda that has survived. I remember one of these being read out loud to me. I was in a seminary class, and in the row in front of me and over a bit was a woman who was about 8.5 months pregnant, and our professor was reading about somebody who was saying that she came to visit the Asclepion because she had been pregnant for 16 months and was in great pain, and everybody laughed, and this woman goes, "That's not funny," and it was... We're all right, that's not, indeed. So, some of these things are a little sensationalistic, but this is part of what you would do. So in the ancient world, right, if you didn't have a family who could take care of you if you became sick or disabled, in some way unable to work, or you didn't have a religious community that could take care of you, there was no safety net. So as Christianity is being preached, is being taught, as people are seeking converts, the question of, well, what can your God do for me if I get ill is a live question, right? A really important question. In a world without antibiotics, right? In a world in which broken bones won't always get set in ways that will keep you functioning at your best, right? There are real economic consequences to some of these illnesses, of course. So when we look at healing and health and wholeness in the ministry of Jesus, there's some things we want to think about or maybe keep in mind. I should point out we've got a couple of chairs in the front if people in the back are looking for a place to sit. Also some chairs stacked up in the back. We can fit. We've got like a huge capacity in this room. I'm sure of it. Some things about healing, health, and wholeness. The Bible's not necessarily aware of some of these distinctions, but in recent years, disability advocates whose writings have kind of found their way into conversation with biblical studies have done a lot to kind of expand our understanding of how the Bible talks about healing. And again, these aren't terms that everybody necessarily uses, and I'm going to kind of simplify a little bit. Some of you probably work in these fields or are more familiar with some of these distinctions, and I welcome hearing more about that. But we want to talk about the difference between curing and healing. These are often used synonymously in English. To put it simply, a cure can be what you do to get rid of an ailment of some kind, right? You've broken a bone. The cure is to have the bone set and maybe put into a cast. There are some illnesses you can take a pill for or get a shot for, and you're, quote unquote, back to normal when it's done. Healing usually involves a bigger question of one's kind of reintegration into life, right? What are the ways in which an ailment or a disease creates a stigma for you socially, right? Or creates other ways in which it's hard to get around in the world. And these are connected to another distinction, the distinction between an ailment and a disability. Again, some of you know this material much better than I do, but an ailment is usually talked about kind of the thing that's medically wrong with you, to use that language, right? Whether that's an illness, whether that's some kind of physical impairment. While a disability are the ways in which the world in which you live makes that ailment more and more difficult for you to get around in. Does that make sense? So in a place, in a building or in a city where there are no ramps, for example, somebody who can't walk, that ailment, that disability, the disability is where it gets compounded because of their inability to get places, right? The places that lack accessibility. Do you see the distinction there? So curing is often used to describe getting rid of an ailment, right, or reversing an ailment, while a healing is how do you also get rid of the disabilities. And some of these disabilities are physical, like I've mentioned. Some of them are stigmas, social stigmas, certain kinds of illnesses or diseases lead to people being shunned or unable to take on certain jobs, things like that. Does that make sense? The distinction makes sense here? It raises the question, can somebody be healed without being cured? Right? Are there ways in which somebody might have a quote-unquote incurable illness or something chronic or even terminal, but still could their community around them work toward their healing, right? How much of that is psychological? How much of that is social? How much of that is emotional and economic? Does that make sense? Right? How do those things work together? Which raises the question of what does Jesus do for people, which we'll get to in just a moment. We also want to talk about the illusion of perfect health, which in our society is something that, you don't have to watch a lot of television and watch a lot of commercials to see this put out there, right? As if there is such a thing as perfect health. Again, disability advocates will often talk about people in the world or talk about the world as divided up into people living with disabilities and people not yet living with disabilities, right? In other words, we are all on our way, folks, to a life of less health, right? Or more precarious health or suffering more disabilities in our capacity to navigate the world in which we live. Does that make sense? So sometimes when we see healing stories, right, we get this sense of, oh, and Jesus restored that person to perfect health or to good health. Or we'll see Jesus say something like, your faith has made you well. So we want to think about what do we mean when we hear made you well? Like what do we have in mind when we think about wellness or human wholeness? That's what I want to say about those three things. Just kind of complicate, right, the way in which we think about health and how that helps us get to the question of what is Jesus doing in some of these stories. We all on board? All right, good. I think that gets me through the medical and social part that I really know nothing about except what I've read, but I'm trying. And again, some of you know more about some of these areas of conversation that we can have. I want to look at some passages, and I've got 6 passages here that I've drawn from the Gospels and 2 from the book of Acts that describe a healing. And I've put them on the tables. So 2 tables have passage number 1. You've got some handouts there on some white sheets where Jesus heals a blind man. We're told his name is Bartimaeus. Passage 2, Peter and John, these are 2 of Jesus' followers who heal somebody who's unable to walk. That's this table here and kind of in the middle. Table 3, I think there's 2 tables over there against the wall. You've got the story of Jesus healing a woman with chronic hemorrhaging, which is a passage you might or might not know. One table is passage 4 over on this side. Peter, this is again the book of Acts. Jesus has already resurrected, gone to heaven, sent the Holy Spirit, and Peter now brings somebody back to life. 5 is maybe in the back corner. I forgot. 5 or 6. You've got 5, that table, excellent, where Jesus heals a woman with a crooked back. And then we have an exorcism for table 6, you're the lucky ones, where Jesus frees a man from a legion of demons. If you're not at a table, Rocky's got some spare sheets for you. If you are watching on the live stream, use the chat, look up one of these passages, and here are the 2 questions that the groups are all answering. What does healing mean for the person or the people in this story? In other words, how is the healing more than only deliverance from some kind of ailment or condition? And how might it affect multiple dimensions of life? In other words, what else appears to be going on based on what the story tells you? And 2, does the story give any indication about the motives behind the healing? In other words, do we get a sense of what the healer is trying to do or trying to convey through the healing? So I'm going to give you about 10, 12 minutes to dig into the passage. You might want to, if your table's too big, you can split up into 2 subgroups. You might want to read the passage out loud. You can do whatever you want. And if you have questions or need me, just flag me down. And again, online, you are welcome to use the chat and get a conversation brewing. And I'll call us back in about 12 minutes. I'm going to call us back together and get some feedback from the tables. Doris is going to run around with the microphone. If one person from each table might be willing just to tell us something that came, we don't have time to go in too much depth, but Doris, we'll start with these 2 tables here in the front. They both have Mark 10, Jesus and Bartimaeus. Any bold people, either one of these tables, want to say something about what you uncovered in your discussion? I know some of these people, they're not that shy. Thank you.
So this Should I summarize the story or just go into?
Just go into, I think, kind of what you got with the questions. Just kind of a brief insight.
In this particular case, Bartimaeus is given sight, and I think, as we talked about, there are many healers that probably walked within the community, but in this particular case, it's a story about how Bartimaeus' faith, and then acknowledgement of Jesus as Son of David, and the divinity of him, and has healed him without Jesus touching him, but simply the acknowledgement that Jesus recognized that Bartimaeus saw him as the Son of God, and therefore his faith alone is what healed him, and said, now you may go on. And initially the crowd that was around Bartimaeus shunned him publicly and prevented him, or at least chastised him for trying to approach Jesus. And then ultimately, they actually, once Jesus acknowledged Bartimaeus, they said, okay, go ahead, talk to Jesus. He's acknowledged you. And so it was a statement about faith, not just for Bartimaeus, but those who had witnessed this, and for us, quite frankly.
That's great. Anybody from this table want to add? If not, you can just tell me to pass. Okay.
We took a different approach because we said, what indication is there that this man has faith? Because, yes, he called him Son of David and this kind of thing, but that could have been something he had heard because the man was a beggar, so his listening to all people around him, is that something he just knew? So where is the history that there was faith on his part? One of the things we came to the conclusion for the second one, too, is that Jesus noticed him. And yes, he shouted out, but Jesus noticed him and stopped, and kind of the acknowledgement that everybody is worth seeing and and being heard.
Yeah. Great. Good stuff out of these tables, right? I mean, the question is, what is faith? And what does it mean to link faith with healing? Is healing a kind of reward for faith? Is that what this is getting at, or not? Or does faith always bring healing? There's plenty of people who pray for healing all of the time, people of great faith, and who never see it. So I mean, that can be a dangerous connection to make. But how does the story at least invite us to ask some of those questions? And the crowd are just jerks in this story, right? They're trying to silence him until all of a sudden they're like, oh, hey, he's calling for you. You get a sense of the fickleness and how this is something he also suffers in the midst of this. Great. How about table 2? I think it's there in the middle. You've got a story of, Peter and John healing a man who's unable to walk at the temple one day. Anybody feeling bold?
Well, you can add if I don't get it right. We talked about a few things. One was you noticed that there was an emphasis put on seeing this person, looking directly in the eyes, and the response of Peter and John looking directly at him. There was there was a message about being seen. And then we also talked about what was the point of this, and I think we landed that it was maybe a parable, and not to be taken too literally, and that it's about was this kind of a promotion of the church and of the community of believers, that this doesn't seem all that tenable from a healing standpoint medically, but it was maybe there were so many people watching that it was really important at that time in a young church to show the power of healing in the name of Jesus.
Thank you. Yeah, if we were to keep reading in Acts 3, we'd see that there's a big public speech after this because a crowd gathers and thousands of people convert. It turns into quite a day.
So we talked about healing a lot and recognized that there was healing throughout this story. The community in which the lame man lived contributed not to his cure, but to his healing by helping him to have a sustenance that he needed to live. So they would carefully take him and position him so that he could get money to do that. And then Peter comes along and says, I'm going to heal you. I'm not going to simply give you money and continue what the community has done. And so it's a fuller sense of healing because it brings this person to a level in which can participate in his own life and make his own choices.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the story begins, we're told that every day people put him at the entrance to the temple so that he might ask for money for people coming in. So we get a sense of his kind of regularity, so to speak, in this spot. How about number 3, the woman with chronic hemorrhaging? Those tables, I think, are over here.
Well, we first of all noted, unlike in the where he saw the person, she had to fight her way up through the crowd to get to him, and was terrified to even ask for help and healing, but she still believed enough to do it. And secondly, I think as her motives were obviously, I'm going to make sure I say this right. Her motives were to rejoin society. As a bleeding woman in that time, constantly, she would have been shunned. And that his changing her whole life.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're told she's been suffering from this ailment for 12 years. This is the woman, if you know this story, she sneaks up on Jesus while in the crowd and says, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. And so he doesn't even realize he knows he's done something. He feels power going out of him. But like you said, there is no seeing, there is no looking in the eye here. She kind of sneaks up behind him in the crowd until he stops. But Mark.
A further thought on this story. In January of 2016, there was a group of us from Westminster who went with Tim to the Holy Land, and we ended up spending some time at the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. There is the remains of a synagogue which exists from that time period, so this is a place where Jesus probably preached, and adjacent to it is a Catholic church. And in the Catholic Church, there are a series of murals that are all along the walls describing the healing miracles of Jesus. And for this story, the painting, it's probably 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, something like that. It goes from the pavement to about 12 inches above ground. So what you see are sandals and feet and one hand. One hand is reaching across, and at the moment where the outstretched finger touches the garment, there is kind of a white spot, displaying power, things of that sort.
We might see this art in a few minutes, too.
Okay.
Just so
Well, sorry
people
to
are getting
spoil
excited.
your story.
No. In case people are pulling their phones out, trust me, it's coming. Yeah.
Okay, well, but I just remember being there and looking at that photo and really having a whole different feeling towards this story than perhaps I had before, because this reducing it down to someone not tapping a person on the shoulder, but being at ground level, being below everyone else, really made a powerful impact.
Yeah.
We also want to emphasize that he sought out who touched my robe, and then he says, "Your faith made you well." And it was the power, the faith that she had, not so much any motive on Jesus' part. It was her faith that if she could only just touch his robe.
Yeah. Thank you. It's worth noting he's on his way. This is not in the verses I gave you. He's on his way to heal the daughter of a synagogue official, a named person, VIP in town. She touches his garment and he stops, right? While this young girl is dying, he stops and says, "Who touched me?" And you can imagine everybody being, "We don't really have time for this conversation, Jesus." He stops, and then she comes forward and tells him her whole story, which is interesting. And he also refers to her as daughter, which is not common in the Gospels for that kind of a term to be used. So Yeah, a beautiful story. We could spend all day on it. One table has passage 4. I forgot which one table you are. Hopefully you know. Aha, here, and then some folks in the... Peter brings Tabitha back to life. This is a woman who has died, obviously, and Peter raises her from the dead.
Yeah. I was just nominated and elected by landslide to speak for this table.
Congratulations. It's whoever Doris hands the microphone to is basically the...
So we have the story of Peter bringing Tabitha back to life. In response to question 1, what this means for the people in this story, it was clear that Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas, was not just a doer of good works, but a leader of a group of people or a community of people who were engaged in good works, or what we would maybe think of more now, sort of like local mission outreach. And so her passing was so profound for this community that they immediately sent for Peter, who was nearby, and said, please come to us. And so at the outset, what the healing meant for the people in this story was simply that this woman of great significance to them, they asked for Peter's help, they got it, but one person at the table made a really good point that, okay, so after all this is over and she's back, that part of the implication for this is now there needs to be, for lack of a better word, succession planning. Who is going to take over for Tabitha when she actually dies?
She dies again.
Again,
Yeah.
right, actually reaches the end of her life, which I thought was a really great insight after just reading this passage once. In terms of the indications about the motives behind the healing, we kind of settled on the motive being that for the ask was what I said before, but the other motive behind it is sort of Peter using this healing as a way to convince people to believe. That the last verse in the passage says that the news of this spread widely and many came to believe in the Lord. And so there's this sense that in the same way we hear in other parts of the gospel, Jesus saying, I have done this so that you would believe. That there's this sense that now Peter, having been vested with the power that Jesus gave to his disciples before he ascended, is doing that same thing for that same reason. And then lastly, what we really struggled with, someone asked a great question like, all right, do you all believe that this actually happened? Because this is medically impossible, right? And that actually got us into the whole question like, well, but do we need to believe that it actually happened in order for it to inspire us to faith?
Yeah.
So
Thank you. Let's go to table 5. I need to kind of keep us rolling here. Table 5 has Jesus heals a woman with a crooked back.
So what we realized here is that, unlike some of the other stories, that Jesus called on this woman. She did not assert herself. He cured her. He stopped preaching in the synagogue and cured her. It was the Sabbath. So he was performing this miracle in front of a crowd of people and clergy. And the priest in the synagogue called him out for doing something on the Sabbath when it should be a day of rest. And he called them hypocrites and said, well, don't you take your donkey to water on the Sabbath? Like, why are you getting down on me for curing this woman who's been suffering for 18 years? And as a result, the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things being done. And he taught a lesson beyond just the healing power of faith in this one, and just that there are some actions that require us to obey a higher law.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we're going to go to table 6, or the group doing, whoever's doing it. But it's an interesting story, right? That she doesn't even speak. She's not asked if she wants to be healed. He just kind of calls her out and heals her. And that turns into this controversy about what can you do on the Sabbath. And So the synagogue leader is kind of like, hey, we've got 6 great days we can heal. You know, it's just not this one. And Jesus' response appears to be like, why would you not set somebody free on a day like today, right? All right. Yeah, the exorcism. We can sew this up in a minute or two.
This is a very complex story where Jesus meets with a man who is possessed by demons. He's an outcast. He's living outside the city in chains because he's, naked and not doing well, probably suffering from mental illness. But the Bible says he's suffering from a possession of demons, and Jesus engages with the demons, wants to exorcise them from the man, and he puts the demons into a herd of pigs, which then throw themselves into the lake. The man is restored to health and wants to come. We finished up with the last few verses, Matt, I hope you don't mind, of this section, saying that the man wanted to come with Jesus as he was leaving, and he said, no, go back to your city and proclaim what God has done for you, which speaks to number 2, what is the motive behind the healing. We thought this was important, that he was like sending this man to be a missionary and saying, this is what God has done. So many complicated things. This man has been restored to health. Now what's the community going to do with him? Is he going to take him back? And the other thing is a common theme I've heard throughout the whole room is that Jesus saw him and had pity on him and healed him. And he was worthy of being healed. And so Jesus, we're all worthy of being healed.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I like to answer the second questions from the perspective of the Quran.
Of course.
So in the Quran, Jesus is the manifestation in flesh of God's signs and mercy. So the healings is to display the mercy of God and the display of his sign, because anything that Jesus does, even resurrecting the dead, is by God authorization.
Yeah, thank you. Reminds me of the passage from Acts 3 as well, where Peter is quite clear they're healing this man in the name of Jesus Christ. And so we'll look for that language in various places, how Jesus heals out of his own power, how others heal in his name. The passage in Luke 8, complicated for sure, but also this, I'm glad you brought up, will they welcome him back? Right? We don't know for how long, but they've been undergoing this ritual of basically chaining him up in the tombs to avoid either hurting himself or others over and over and over. And now that he is healed and, quote unquote, in his right mind, I think is some of the language used there, what do you do now? Like, they're going to welcome him back in the village? Not, I mean, these are interesting questions that the story doesn't take us into. It does tell us that the people in the village all asked Jesus to please leave, which is fascinating, right? Why would that happen? So a lot going on. You all have picked up on some really important things. Trying to anticipate what you might have said, I've got a couple of slides to talk about what some of these things look like, that there's more going on here than curing ailments. We saw a couple of passages about people who had to beg to survive, who presumably no longer have to. And so they're also, we might assume, set free from economic jeopardy. We've got questions about impurity or defilement and religious consequences. What does it mean to be possessed by unclean spirits? What does it mean for the woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years? What kinds of things are or are not available to them because of their ailments? And how has Jesus set them free from those things? Where does social exclusion play a part in some of this? The woman with the bent back, the Greek is really interesting. The grammar is about as crooked as what it's trying to say about her back, but it seems to be describing somebody who can't look up even, and what that means for social interactions, right? To never be able to look at people face to face or in the eye. Like what might that have meant for her? The tyranny of unclean spirits and demonic powers, we're really not going to settle that today, but to talk about what does it mean to be set free from things over which we have no control, things that make us dangerous to ourselves and to others, and what does it mean to be set free from things that might be obstacles to faith, right, for ourselves or for others. I think we can tease out different dimensions of these in a variety of passages. At the same time, and this is true with really any healing passage, not just the ones we looked at today, we want to be careful of a couple of things, at least two things. There's a healing story in John's Gospel which is too long for us to look at today, but it starts off with this. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man who was blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And you think that's a really insensitive question, although I hear it still quite frequently from people, either about other people's sufferings. Right? What do you think they did wrong? What do you think their parents did wrong? Some of this about faith to anger God, or just simply what did they do wrong to now have this illness, right? It's one of the ways we try to make sense of sometimes a world that doesn't make sense. Jesus redirects the question. He says basically neither one. That's not what this is about. But we want to be aware of a theology and symbolism that stigmatizes ailments and disabilities, that imply that there's somehow spiritual deficiencies. And we have this language all over the place. Right? Amazing Grace was blind, but now I see, for example. We know what that's trying to say, but what does that do to stigmatize blindness, right, in a community? And how does that language perhaps lead us in ways we don't even always realize to assume that if somebody is sick, they must have done something wrong, or that somehow their faith is not as strong as others? As a preacher, it's really tough when a passage falls in front of you that ends with, "Go, your faith has made you well." Because what's the implication of that for some, right? I thought I had faith, I'm still ill. I must not have enough faith. And some people preach that, which is, I think, awful. Second caution is to beware of a focus on healing that confuses wellness with holiness, or that idealizes certain kinds of bodies as ideal bodies. Right? What does it mean for an unhealthy body, or a disabled body, or a body suffering from a chronic disease to bear the image of God just as much as a healthy body might? We live in a society that very much idolizes healthy bodies or certain kinds of bodies. How does that slip into our theological ways of thinking sometimes? This is why I love the fact that Jesus, when he appears to his followers in John's gospel and in Luke's gospel after his death, still has the wounds of crucifixion on his body, right? In other words, his wounded body, right, broken through violence, through human violence, right, is still part of what it means for him in resurrection. Not to say that resurrection doesn't mean healing, right? It's just that he doesn't come back now as some kind of perfected, idealized body, right, with six-pack abs, and, he's not cut the way that I'm not also cut. But do you know what I mean? We see this in art, too. We see a lot of art where sometimes Jesus's body looks, fits all of these certain ideals. But Betty?
So I feel like we might miss the point if we don't take out the difference between healing and being made well. And I don't know if you want me to go on here just a second. Because in our stories, it doesn't say, "I made you see. I made you back better." Mm-hmm. I made you well. And you used the example of the song Amazing Grace, but the point of it is blind, but now I see, is not he was blind, but now he sees, is it? It's about, I thought slavery was great and I was all about it, right? And then I found God and I realized my own fault, my fault. And now I see through my faith a better world. Wouldn't you say that that's what that song is about?
That's what the song's about.
Not literal.
But how does the symbolism of blindness?
But yeah, I hear that, but still the difference between well and healed, or well and cured, is that in faith, people who have all kinds of disease and disability can live a full, right, complete life.
Right. Yeah, I would now agree with that. It gets complicated too, and we recognize that when it says your faith has made you well, the verb there in Greek is almost always saved. In other words, your faith has saved you. We tend to think, exactly, saved is different than well.
But it's different than healed.
It's different than healed. Mm-hmm. Correct.
Saved is a faith thing.
It is. Even that word "saved" just simply means to be rescued. I mean, it's got a wide range of meaning. in a lot of church talk, right, saved usually means forgiven, right, or set right with God and on your way to heaven. So, I mean, it's how we kind of think about that more holistically as part of what's going on. Like our language sometimes lets us down here and might direct our vision a little too narrowly, which I think you're illustrating really well. Try not to use seeing language around that, but here you go, Mark. Here's what Mark was talking about. This is the painting on the wall in the church in Magdala, in the chapel there. I'm going to move on. I'm going to advance the slide. Just a couple of quick observations about what else we see in Jesus. He doesn't actively seek out those who suffer from ailments. They tend to find him. In other words, Jesus never enters a village and says, hey, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, I'm doing a healing. Make sure everybody's there, right? He shows up and people come to him, or he's somewhere and people just find him, and he always responds to them. In other words, it doesn't appear that healing is his primary mission, right? It doesn't appear that this is what it's all about. We also want to note that the people who are transformed, who are healed under his ministry, get sick again, we assume, and die again, we assume. We assume Tabitha dies a second time. In other words, if Jesus has come to make everybody live in perfect health in perpetuity, it didn't work, right? So what are these healings meant to do? What are they meant to convey, right? And what does Jesus understand a life well lived, or what the good life is supposed to look like? In other words, his ministry is about more than spreading temporary wellness, right? That's not to say that the healings are all just attempts to gather a crowd, right? But how are the healings illustrative of something else that he's up to? And I think it's fair to say, too, he appears to cure and to heal, to follow up that distinction. In other words, yes, he treats ailments. We also see him at times doing things that appear to be addressing disabilities, especially in terms of reputation. Think of the woman with the hemorrhage that he calls and publicly acknowledges her healing, for example. Bartimaeus, the fact that he sees Bartimaeus and kind of overrules the crowd's efforts to silence Bartimaeus or to keep Bartimaeus off to the side. Just to close up, I want to talk about how might we expand the gospel's healing stories a little bit. How do we, in our own lives, when we think about the church's ministry of healing, some of you are deacons, others are in the healthcare field and might be doing that for religious reasons, other humanitarian reasons, but how do we consider the people who need healing in the world as more than passive objects who are just there to reflect God's goodness? See what I mean? Sometimes the biblical stories can do that. I worry about the woman in Luke 13 who is never asked, do you want to be well? The assumption that the Bible makes is everybody who's suffering from some kind of an ailment wants to have that ailment removed. That's not always the case with everybody. You talk to people, some people in the deaf community, for example, who talk about being deaf as a different way of being in the world, who see sign language as a different language, just like English, just like French, just like Spanish, and talk about accommodations, right, or resources more than they want to talk about being able to hear. We need to notice the range of ailments that are missing from the Gospels that just aren't talked about but are parts of our own world. I think about children's health. We don't see many children in the Gospels, certainly not many sick children. Elder care, obviously, is a big part of life today when we think about health care. We don't really see a lot of this taking place, right? What would Jesus do when encountered with people near the end of their lives? Focus on women's health, especially reproductive health, just not much attention. People with chronic illnesses, perhaps the man suffering from the legion of demons is the closest we get to this, but a lot of people, of course, live in a kind of chronic state, with something that has effects on their life. Not to say that Jesus isn't concerned with these things, we just don't get a full range of the human experience reflected in the Gospels. And there are, of course, invisible disabilities that the Gospels don't necessarily talk about. Most of the people Jesus encounters have some kind of ailment or disability that's pretty visible or pretty detectable, right? We might put mental health in here as well as plenty of other kinds of physiological disabilities that people suffer from. Well, we're out of time to do a theology of healing. I'll just say this, that he appears to be working to extend wholeness to people who folks in his world might have thought were living beyond wholeness's reach. That's significant for how we as a church think about how do we carry on the ministry of Jesus in our own world. I do not have gifts of healing, miraculously or otherwise, but there are other ways in which people are healed and can be healed than just simply miracle. I would rather live in the 21st century than the first century, personally. Jesus, I think, redemonstrates God's commitment to human flourishing, as the church does as well, in our own ways of supporting healing. Like, there's no accident that a lot of hospitals were founded by churches and religious communities, right, back in the day. This is a significant part of the church's historic mission. And I think Jesus promises or provides a holistic salvation. In other words, this is about more than just getting rid of the things that oppress us. Things like belonging and security and reintegration are parts of this healing. And so how does the church mirror that? How do churches mirror that in our own world? Or in other words, last slide, how does the church, all of us, play a part in the healing that is an aspect of God's reign or of God's kingdom? These are things I think communities can do as well. Even if one of you is sick, I'm going to recommend you call your doctor. You could go to Jessica, but for prayers and things. But for medical advice, I usually go to the doctor first. But the church also plays a role in other aspects of human health and human wholeness, as individuals and as a community. Next week, Margaret's going to talk about a theology of kings. Oh, she'll be thrilled to know everybody was groaning. I'm not sure her theology is in favor of kings. It's going to talk about why is there so much kingship language in the Bible, and is it positive or negative? What might that mean for us? This was planned months ago. Thank you for all of your feedback and listening and everything.